Hi, so for week two, we are going to be first putting Bellamy in context. The first thing you read for this class, the ones who walk away from OMOS, left us with this question of what happened to those people who simply rejected the idea that a situation that's unacceptable to them can't be somehow improved. And so the first of our major primary source texts is Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward. And Looking Backward is this great Rip Van Winkle story. It's a story of somebody who goes to sleep and wakes up in the future. It is a utopia, but technically speaking, it's a Uchronia, which means that the good place isn't located here where we are in the present moment, but is located somewhere in the future. And so that's the technical name for it, if you care. So let's get started. Why Bellamy, right? I could have started in 15, 16. I could have started anywhere. Why would I start the course in Bellamy? And I'll tell you, sometimes when you want to get your mind around something that's long and complex, if you're thinking, oh, there's a very long and complex story and I want to know more about it, you might begin at the beginning. But I'll tell you, that's a good way to never finish or never get anywhere satisfying. And so in this class, what we're doing is we're beginning at the point, I think, when some of the most exciting utopian thinking was happening, and in one of the places where it was happening, and that was here in the US. So as we think about utopia, not as a perfect place, but as a better place than where the writer and the reader are currently sitting, right? We can sort of imagine that in the past that was conceived as sort of a Garden of Eden kind of moment. And in some ways, if Adam and Eve hadn't been kicked out of the Garden of Eden, you can sort of see how, as they raised generations of their children there, that would have become a utopian space with lots of consanguinity, which is a fancy word for having sex with people you were closely related to, incest. So I don't know what would have happened if they hadn't gotten out of there. Anyway, this course we don't have a textbook. You'll see at the notes for the bottom of this lecture that I point you to a textbook. The name of that textbook, Utopian Thought in the Western World, it's available there here at FIU at the library. There in the library, you can get an electronic version, so you don't even have to risk your health by going in there. And you can see it begins with like paradise and the millennium, right? Meaning that maybe those first 1,000 years, and we're going through classical antiquity. And finally we get to Renaissance period. It's just taking us literally ages to get anywhere. And you might think to yourself, well, here are the first 18 chapters. I don't see Bellamy anywhere. Well, he doesn't show up in this textbook, the textbook we're not using, until way at the end. He's sort of tucked in there in chapter 32, right before the textbook ends. And that's because they were covering a lot of ground, and they were covering a lot of ground. I mean that not just in terms of temporal space, right? Like the long arc of time, but I also mean in terms of physical space. They were moving across Europe and ancient Rome and Greece. They were moving in Mesopotamia, right? So the writers of the textbook that we're not using were thinking about utopia in a very capacious way. And I wanted to narrow it down and just think about it in terms of the American utopian experience, because you could make the argument that this country was founded on the idea that there has to be a better way. We don't have to do it the way that people who raised us and designed the society in which we were born, we don't have to do it the way they did it. That's the American ideal, right? So let's look at where does Bellamy show up there? Well, if we look at America and the Utopian Dream at the Yale Library's webpage for that, what you discover is, of course, Bellamy is right in the middle. He's not the first person you would get to, and that's okay too. That is, I'm just gonna pause right here and do something about that phone. Sorry about that. It was actually a telemarketing call to tell me about my car's extended warranty. All right, so getting back to Yale Libraries, right? So, and I want to send you to this page because there's some interesting stuff. things that happened before Bellamy was on the scene are actually pretty worth looking at. And in week 3, I'm going to link to one of my favorite stories that predates Bellamy. But right now, I just want you to notice where Bellamy shows up here. And that is, he's in 1888, and people have been thinking about this and worrying about this country and its utopian impulse since the 1600s. So Bellamy is very late to come to the party, and I know that. And I want you to just stay with me on this, because I really do feel that the reasons for starting with Bellamy are so strong. One of the main reasons, before I get to the next slide, is simply this. If I'd started with Harrington or Francis Bacon or Thomas Mate, or just any of those guys going way, way back in time, this class would be very much a class about only men's ideas, right? So that's one problem. And the other problem, because we've got thinkers, women hold up half the sky, right? We've got thinkers in all genders. The other reason for not beginning way back in America, or even way back in classical antiquity, is because so many interesting things happen in the second half of the 20th century. So many things are happening now. They're interesting in terms of utopian impulse, and we just would never get to cover that. We'd get to the last week of class, and it would just be sort of like chapter 32 in that textbook, right? Where you're just like, oh, and now that the class is almost over, here's some interesting stuff that you can relate to that has resonance in your own experience. I just really didn't want to do that. Okay, so here's my last slide. I'm about to wrap up here for lecture 1. Why Bellamy? Why are we starting right now? And the answer is, this guy had a huge impact. As you're listening to, and I strong, you're required to, but people are required to do all kinds of things they don't do. Please listen to the podcast that's attached to the bottom of lecture 2. And the reason for that is they do a really good job there of explaining the sophisticated socioeconomic theory that's at the heart of what Bellamy is talking about. What they don't tell you is that because of his use of metaphor, because of his frame story, because of all the things that he's getting right as a storyteller, a lot of people who didn't think of themselves as being politically active suddenly had their consciousness raised. Suddenly they're just like, wow, I'm starting to understand my predicament. And your predicament sometimes it's hard to see, because there's so many people who are worse off, right? And the people who are better off seem so far above you. There's no point in thinking about how you could make your life better. Well, Bellamy starts to explain, certainly to people in that middle tier, that middle range, oh yeah, your life is a bowl of cat turds, and it could be a bunch better, and here's how. And he allowed them to have conversations with each other, and they set up Bellamy clubs that lasted 15, 20 years. I mean, across the Atlantic, people were doing it. Bellamy just had an incredible influence. He transferred these impulses into something you might just sit around and talk about over a cup of coffee, into something that people did. They started to live their utopian ideals. And certainly there had been people before. When we get to week 3, you'll hear me talk about people, little fringe, hippie people like me, who go off and they're like, hey, I'm going to do my own utopian thing. No, that's not what Bellamy was into. Second reason, and to me, this is just huge, Bellamy's scale of his vision. We're going to read a lot of stories. Certainly the ones who walked away from Omelas is an example. When we get to module 2 and Herland, that's another example of imagining your utopia as this island of calm in this world of chaos and trouble. And that's not what Bellamy said. He said, no, let's pull everybody in. Let's not imagine that we ran off somewhere in a little gated community and it was just fine for us. Let's try to see what it would be like if it was fine for everybody. And so he has a national and international scope to his thinking about how we might reshape human relationships. And I think that's really exciting. And I thought that was just a great place to start. And you'll notice everywhere we go in this course, as we look at our primary and secondary text, notice how big or small the imagination is of the person who's describing a utopian space. Like Walt Disney wanted utopia like in Disneyland, or in like a Disneyland community. a very limited utopia. Excuse me, my hay fever is still kicking. Okay, last reason, I'm going to wrap it up. I think I think Bellamy's aged well, and we're definitely going to talk a lot more about this in the second 8 minutes for the second lecture for week 2. Bellamy looks at all of these ideas, all of this technology, all of this possibility of emerging technological innovations in the 18th century, things that we would later come, like the telegraph and the warehouse, all of these things that now we're really accustomed to. We're like, yeah, why wouldn't you have music from different performers and different possibilities piped into your house? Well, nobody was thinking about those things in 1888. But Bellamy was. He introduced us a lot of ideas that we see actually came to pass. The credit card, the Amazon warehouse idea, right? He's really ahead of his time in some ways that describe 20th century life in America. That I hope his description of his time will resonate with you as you sit. Excuse me. And listen to me here in the year 2020. Sorry about all the coughing. Don't get old. There is nothing in it. There's just like nothing in it. All right. I'm going to stop here. Thanks so much for listening.